A mother opens a familiar red and white box because a headache shouldn't win. A cap twists off with the easy promise of every medicine cabinet in America. A couple of capsules rattle into a palm. And within an hour, an ordinary day begins to tilt into something that will end on the evening news. Because in the first week of the fall of 1982, 7 people around Chicago take relief for pain and never come back. You hear the phrase product tampering, and it sounds clinical and distant. Yet inside the hospitals it feels like lightning because victims who were healthy minutes ago are suddenly unresponsive and blue around the lips. And the doctors who keep people alive for a living look at their monitors and see numbers that don't make sense for a headache remedy. And the line that divides everyday trust from existential fear moves several miles closer to the front door. Before we go deeper, here's the promise you can hold me to. By the end, you'll know the chain of moments that turned a household name into a national emergency. Why a tiny piece of packaging you hardly notice today exists at all. The suspect lanes that investigators kept circling even when the headlines cooled. The copycat ripples that followed, and the quiet clues that matter more than the urban myths. And along the way, we'll keep opening loops that will close just when you think you've solved it. It begins with small, ordinary actions that don't feel like the beginning of a case file. Someone buys pain relief after work. Someone else grabs a bottle from the bathroom shelf without looking. A teen takes 2 after practice because that's what the label has said since forever. And then the calls stack up in emergency rooms where teams work in that fierce hush that means this is bad and there isn't much time. And the shared realization spreads in waves. These aren't coincidences, and what's killing people is not the symptom they tried to treat, but the pill they trusted to help. The first pattern interrupt arrives not in a lab, but in a kitchen, when an investigator, dangerously curious and properly protected, unscrews a cap from a suspect bottle and smells the faint bitter almond warning that chemists never forget. And a field test confirms the nightmare word cyanide, which is a word we will not dissect in this program because method isn't the point. Impact and investigation are. You can picture the fleeky image now without us lingering on it. A police evidence table under fluorescent lights, a familiar brand name that once meant comfort now taped off behind a yellow line, and technicians moving with measured hands while phones start ringing in offices where the next decisions will cost millions and maybe save lives. Here's an open loop you'll want to keep. Contamination at the factory versus contamination after the product is already on store shelves, because that single fork in the road changes everything about who could do it, how the poison entered the lives of strangers, and how you even begin to search for a person who never touched a victim, yet killed with obscene intimacy by borrowing trust. Johnson & Johnson, which owns the brand, does something in hours that corporate playbooks later call historic. They tell people to stop taking the product. They issue warnings that risk the company's crown jewel. They begin a recall that will grow from a city to the whole country. And they decide that the only acceptable number of unsafe bottles in American homes is 0, even if it means pulling all of them. And in the middle of the panic, they open their doors to investigators and the press instead of trying to paper the sky. That decision, the one that places human life over inventory, creates a second pattern interrupt because a corporation's reflex in a crisis is often to minimize. Yet here, the speed of the recall and the bluntness of the public messaging help stop the death toll. And later, when the brand eventually returns to shelves, people remember that the company chose people, and that memory becomes money only because it first became trust. Every murder mystery asks you to follow a timeline, and this one asks you to follow a supply chain. Raw materials to capsules, capsules to bottles, bottles to boxes, boxes to warehouses, and boxes to stores where a stranger with 10 quiet minutes could do terrible work. And the testing that follows, painstaking, repetitive, statistical, suggests the nightmare nobody wants to believe, which is that the tampering likely occurred after the product was shipped and displayed, because clusters of contaminated bottles appear in a specific metropolitan area rather than evenly scattered across the country. That conclusion doesn't close a loop, it opens 3 more. Who had the nerve to stand in a drugstore aisle without shaking? How do you add a deadly substance to capsules without alerting a single clerk? And why take the risk more than once? Because we're looking at multiple bottles in multiple locations. And risk, if you're sane, usually shrinks with each crime rather than yawning wider. Imagine the non-cinematic reality of that errand. A person who looks like anyone else. A pocket with something that never should be near a pharmacy. A moment when the aisle is empty except for the sound of a cooler humming. A cap that doesn't crackle because back then there is no tamper-evident seal. A few precise motions that we refuse to detail here. And then a box goes back to its spot, as if nothing in the world changed. Though for someone whose name we now speak in memorial, it did. As investigators move from homes to hospitals to stores and back again, the city absorbs a new ritual. People shake bottles next to their ears and smell things that aren't there. Parents lock medicine cabinets as if they're safes, and ordinary headaches go untreated because fear is louder than pain. While television anchors hold up the product with gloved hands, and a nation watches to see whether trust can be rebuilt one package at a time. Here's where a piece of packaging becomes a character. The tamper-evident seal, the shrink band around the cap, the foil you puncture with the end of a spoon, the triple seal language that looks like marketing, but is actually a scar you can touch. And if you're under a certain age, you've never known a world without that crinkle and that peel. Yet it arrived because a killer taught engineers a lesson no one wanted to learn, and manufacturing changed because it had to. That is the societal pivot this case created. From trust the box to trust the seal, from open and pour to inspect and verify. And while regulations and industry standards will get their own paragraphs in textbooks, the reason any of it exists lives in 7 funerals that should never have happened. Let's open the suspect lanes carefully, because this case has reputations and lives attached to it even decades later. And while names have surfaced in reporting and court records as persons of interest or defendants in related crimes, murder charges for the 1982 deaths were never filed. What matters for our map are the methods and the motives that investigators have publicly wrestled with. One lane is the extortionist, the person who, after the murders, sends a letter to the company demanding money and threatening more chaos. A person who is later convicted of extortion rather than homicide and serves time because of the letter rather than the poison, and whose proximity to the case keeps their name orbiting headlines for years, even as direct evidence that they handled the capsules remains contested in public sources. We raise this lane not to litigate it here, but to illustrate how quickly a crime like this attracts opportunists who weaponize fear for cash. Another lane is the local loner archetype who becomes a magnet for suspicion because of statements made to acquaintances and odd behavior around the time of the murders. A person who is publicly scrutinized and, in some tellings, whose life is violently upended not by police but by a man who takes matters into his own hands, reminding us that rumor is an accelerant and vigilantism ruins more cases than it solves. We mention this lane for a different lesson, which is that proximity and strangeness are not proof, and pressure that isn't shaped like evidence bends investigations into expensive circles. The copycat ripples matter too, because once the idea is in the air, frightened people begin seeing it everywhere, and occasionally someone decides to echo it for reasons that range from malice to insurance fraud, which means investigators must pull 1,000 false threads to find a single real one. In the months and years after 1982, other incidents of tampered capsules appear in other cities with other brands, and one in particular later in the decade reignites national concern when a young woman in New York dies after taking poisoned capsules, which is a tragedy in its own right, and a second reminder that the packaging scars we live with are neither theater nor overreaction. For you as a viewer, the pattern interrupt is this. The villain is not only the person with poison, but the information environment that allows a single high-profile method to become cultural vocabulary. And once that vocabulary exists, it refuses to go back into the drawer, which is why manufacturers race to replace capsules with caplets that are harder to tamper with, and why the dullest-sounding regulations end up being the most heroic. If you're running Fleeky's image engine in your head, the next visual isn't a suspect board with string, though we'll get there, but a factory line where bottles glide under a set of stations that heat, shrink, and seal layers you can feel. And that hum becomes a lullaby that lets a nation sleep a little easier. Now we can walk a tighter micro-timeline that investigators and journalists have reconstructed from public records and reporting. Emergency calls spike within hours on that first day. Labs confirm cyanide, police fan out to stores and collect products. The company issues local then national warnings, a recall balloons to the entire country. And federal agencies coordinate with local detectives to build profiles that look nothing like movie masterminds and everything like quiet people with time and nerve. The speed of those early days saves lives, and yet the slowness of what follows, the patient grind of interviews, searches, and tips, is the only way to give victims and families a real chance at closure. Ask yourself what in that sequence required genius, and the answer is very little. Ask yourself what required nerve, and the answer is almost everything. Because standing in an aisle with a plan and a pocket and a clock that could end your life if you're seen is the kind of risk that most human beings reject so completely that it becomes a profile all by itself. That profile doesn't guarantee a face, but it narrows the field to people who can simulate calm, people who practice routines, and people who treat other human beings as abstractions, which is a trait the law can sometimes track without ever catching in the act. We should talk about the role of media and corporate ethics here without slipping into a lecture, because what happened on televisions across the country is part of the case. Anchors showed viewers how to spot the new seals, newspapers printed hotline numbers, and executives went on camera to say, "Don't use our product right now," with a clarity that would make an investor swallow hard, and the result was a cultural drill that rewired habits. In the long view, the way this recall was handled becomes a case study in crisis communication that business schools hold up for decades, not because it was slick, but because it was honest and fast. There's an entire parallel story in how consumer protection rules evolved in response, with tamper-evident packaging becoming standard and criminal penalties for tampering increasing. But the heart of that story is simply this: engineering and law got better because evil forced them to. And somewhere a father taking a child's temperature in 2005 or 2020 has no idea that 1,000 tiny decisions made after 1982 are the reason he trusts the little foil he peels back. That is the strange grace inside this horror. Systems can learn, and if they learn fast enough, a killer who wanted to spread fear ends up sowing vigilance instead. Let's return to the suspects for a moment, because open loops without resolution are unsatisfying. And while we will not convict anyone in a video, we can explain why certain lanes kept investigators' attention. Extortion linked to the brand creates motive and curiosity, but not necessarily access or opportunity, while proximity to stores creates opportunity without motive, and both lanes rub against the hard problem at the center of this case, which is that the scene of the crime is not a house or a car, but a chain of public spaces, any one of which could have been the stage. Evidence in cases like this is an ecosystem: receipts, fibers, fingerprints, witness accounts of people who might have been just another shopper. And the passage of time is a predator in that ecosystem, devouring the delicate clues that might have pointed cleanly to one person, which is why investigators' public statements over the years often land in the gray zone of person of interest rather than the black and white of defendant. When you feel frustrated that there isn't a neat ending, remember that neat endings are a luxury we often retrofit to stories that were, in their living hours, a chaos of almosts and maybes, and that the professional humility to say, "We don't know yet," is not weakness, but respect for truth. Because you watch this channel for method as much as mystery, here's a practical piece you can actually use in your life without becoming paranoid. Trust the boredom of safety rituals, which means reading expiry dates, keeping medications in their original containers, checking seals as a reflex, discarding anything that looks wrong or smells wrong, and never assuming that familiarity equals safety just because you've walked the same pharmacy aisle 100 times. These are not dramatic hero moves. They are quiet habits that change statistics. And if you run a small business that sells or stores consumable goods, build procedures that make tampering difficult and obvious, like cameras facing aisles, not just entrances. Staff trained to recognize odd customer behavior without turning into conspiracy theorists, and inventory checks that notice patterns rather than just counts. Because security is not a single guard at a door. It's a culture that makes quiet crimes noisy. None of this undoes what happened, and none of it will name a killer on its own. But each routine we keep is a stitch that closes a wound the 1982 case opened. We haven't talked about the families yet, because this story doesn't belong to any company or headline. And the right way to hold their grief is to say their ordinary plans were broken by a stranger who treated trust like a toy. And that when we talk about packaging and recalls and suspects, we are really honoring a set of lives that were full of work and school and meals and inside jokes, which is what every violent crime tries to erase. If you've ever watched someone you love swallow a medicine, and then close their eyes on a couch for a nap that you know is safe. You can feel in your bones what was stolen here. Not just life, but the simple permission to relax in your own home. And that's why this case still lives like a shadow in a country that moved on but never forgot. When we keep telling it, we aren't feeding fear. We're naming the reasons vigilance matters, and we're refusing to let an anonymous cruelty write the last sentence. We're near the end, so let's gather the pieces we promised. The minute-to-minute crisis that turned into a national recall. The fork between factory and store that pushed the investigation onto the retail floor. The suspect lanes of extortion and proximity that created heat but not handcuffs. The copycats that proved ideas can be as dangerous as tools. The packaging reforms that you can hold in your hand every time you hear a seal crackle. And the simple habits that turn consumers into quiet guardians. Here is the loop I opened at the beginning, and will close now. The tiny piece of packaging you hardly notice, the shrink band, the foil, the click that feels like overkill, is the artifact left behind by 7 lives. A design choice written in grief that prevents someone's tomorrow from becoming someone else's breaking news. And while no piece of plastic can resurrect a person, it can stand between a stranger and a tragedy, and that matters. Justice in this case, if it ever arrives in a courtroom, will be a headline. But the justice that already exists is the one you feel every time you verify safety without thinking about it. A small ritual that says we learned, and we kept learning, and we choose each other over convenience. If you want a part 2, we can walk the strongest suspect dossiers as they appear in public records and reporting. Unpack the forensic lessons that labs extracted without teaching anyone how to copy the harm, and trace the legislative changes that followed, so you can see how a single week in 1982 rewired an industry. Tell me in the comments if that deep dive helps. For now, remember why we tell this one. Not to mythologize a method, but to honor 7 people by building habits that make the next attempt harder, louder, and lonelier for whoever dares, and to remind ourselves that vigilance doesn't have to be a panic. It can be a quiet, ordinary kindness we extend to each other when we seal what needs sealing and check what needs checking. This is Caseboard Daily. If this gave you something real to hold, follow, and share, and the next time you hear that little crinkle when you twist a cap, let it say what it was designed to say after 1982. You are allowed to trust, because someone made sure you'd know if you shouldn't.